My name is Jerry McLaughlin, president of CleanTV. It's my privilege today to introduce you to somebody by the name of Avi Lipkin, an expert, one of the foremost world experts on the Middle East. Now you might be thinking, I don't live in the Middle East. I live in Australia or New Zealand or maybe the United States. What's the Middle East got to do with me? I've got enough problems of my own. They're all crazy out there anyway. You ever see those guys in the news? Well, I used to kind of think that way as well. Until one day when I heard a man speak, Avi Lipkin. He showed me the connection between the Middle East and the United States and the Western world. There's a lot of things we don't really understand, and that's why he's brought to us today to simplify the very complex. Avi is a graduate of Hebrew University. At 19 years old, he left the United States to make his home in Israel. He's been a spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces. He was in the artillery reserves there for about 16 years. He wrote a book back in 1997 called Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? The world wasn't listening to him then, but they're certainly listening to him now. He warned the world that fanatic Muslims would come on the United States soil as terrorists, aiming at airplanes at landmark buildings. He even mentioned in his lecture series the World Trade Center would be the source of another attack. Without further ado, the man who will tell us a lot of things that are likely to happen next in the Middle East, Avi Lipkin.
Shalom. This is the third in a series of three teachings being done. And this teaching, the first two teachings, the first one dealt with the threat of Islamic terrorism, the revolutionary threat, as well as the evolutionary threats, the collapse of the world economy, the rebuilding of the world economy, Iran, cross-border terrorism. The second subject, a completely different subject, deals with the creation of a Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy party, which will be born soon, which will participate hopefully in the next Israeli elections, probably around 2013. This third teaching is going to be more of what is known in the Christian world as an eschatological teaching or prophecy teaching about Turkey and the role of the fanatic Islam, the Sunni Islam, in end times. Some people call it Gog and Magog. Some people might call it the Armageddon War. And indeed, there are different interpretations as to exactly which war is which. I'm going to try to give an overall picture using current events, military intelligence, private investigation, and try to weave it together with Bible scripture, in other words, Old Testament, New Testament, and to try to make sense of the trends that the world is observing today in the Middle East, and especially in a post-Iran situation. In my first teaching, I spoke about what I believe will be the world's intervention in Iran, the overthrow of the Shiite Ayatollah regime, which is seen in the Sunni Islamic world as a threat to the Sunnis. In other words, the Shiites, who have been more or less 15% of the population of the Islamic world, will wish to impose their brand of Islam on 85% of the Sunnis, of the Muslims. And so I believe what we will see is President Obama leading the world in a process of intervention, international intervention, basically to liberate the people of Iran, which is, of course, a very positive thing, save Israel from nuclear destruction, save the world from nuclear destruction because of the Iranian nuclear project. And by the way, at the time of the taping of this program in February 2009, it has already been made publicly known that the Iranians have enough fissionable material for one bomb. The Iranians do not want one bomb. The Iranian leadership wants many bombs. They want many missiles. And so one reason for the war against Iran will be to deliver Israel and the world from the nuclear threat of a crazed Ayatollah regime in Iran. The second reason for the war with Iran will be, of course, the economic, the almost collapse of the world economic system and the need for confidence-building measures that will restore confidence in the investors and in Wall Street and in the world and in the economy to save the world from economic collapse. And of course, Iran is a spoiler here under the Ayatollah regime. Again, the Iranian people are good people. They want freedom. And much like the Iraqis, they could not overthrow Saddam Hussein without American help. The Iranians cannot overthrow the Ayatollah regime without outside intervention. And the third reason for the war with Iran is that indeed the leadership of the Sunni Islamic world, the Saudis, will command President Obama, who may be a Christian, but his father is, and the tribe of Obama's father are Sunni Muslims loyal to the Saudi leadership. And since the Sunnis do see Iran as a threat, definitely the Shiites' leadership in Iran must be, if not destroyed, it must be weakened and neutralized so as not to pose a threat to the Sunni leadership. Now, this third teaching is going to talk about the unchecked rise of fanatic Sunni Islam as a result of the termination of the Shiite threat. In other words, the Shiite threat, I believe, will be terminated probably within 30 days of the beginning of the foreign intervention. Once the United Nations imposes a foreign, how shall I say, not a foreign, a democratic-based system in Iran, the Shiites will not pose that threat anymore. By the way, it's an interesting footnote that the people of Iran are made up of many, many different ethnic and national groups. The Persians, who are Shiites, are actually not the majority. The majority of the people of Iran are represented by Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, and even Arabs and other groups. But the biggest of all the ethnic groups are the Farsis, the Persians. And so what I predict is we will see, under the leadership of President Obama, an international coalition of nations, probably under the auspices of the United Nations, that will bring together a parliamentary system in Iran that will be representing all of the different factions, all the different groups, very much as we see it took the United States 6 years in Iraq for the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds somehow to find a modus vivendi and work together. This is something that we will have to see happening in Iran. Now, what I want to do is shift completely over now to Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam, which is 85% of the Islamic world, is very, very strong in countries surrounding the Persian Gulf region. In other words, the Shiites are 50-50 with the Sunnis in the Persian Gulf region, but when you go to the outlying countries, such as Indonesia, that has 200 million Sunnis, when you have a country like India, which is a Hindu country, but has 120 million Sunni Muslims. Pakistan is primarily Sunni. Afghanistan is primarily Sunni. Egypt is Sunni. Turkey is Sunni. The Palestinians are Sunni. Saudis are Sunni. Even Syria, under Bashar al-Assad, who is a Shiite, he's an Alawite Shiite, even Syria is 74% Sunni. I'm going to talk now about the unmitigated rise of Sunni Islam in Egypt, which basically means the end of the peace between Egypt and Israel. The rise of the fanatic Sunni Islam in Turkey, which I consider to be the root of the Armageddon war with Israel. We're going to talk about the rise of fanatic Islam in the 6 republics that broke away from the former Soviet Union, the Stans, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. There are all these countries which are Turkic in nature. They're not Turks of Anatolia, but they are Turkic ethnically, and they speak a language similar to Turkish. You're talking about 270 million Sunni Muslims. Saudi Arabia, of course, Algeria. So there is, I believe, a new trend in the Islamic world. We're beginning to see this in Gaza with the Hamas. We're beginning to see this even in the Judea-Samaria so-called West Bank, in which even the so-called Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, is being threatened by a wave of fanatic Sunni Islam of the Hamas in the West Bank. In other words, we may see indeed the complete overthrow of any vestiges of PLO or Fatah rule. It will be all taken over by the fanatic Hamas, which of course will never, ever make peace with Israel or recognize Israel. What I'd like to do at the very beginning is to review history. And I love the American people very much, but most American people have really zero knowledge of the history of 1,400 years in world history and world religions. The United States is a country that was founded in 1776 in the American Revolutionary War. For most Americans, except perhaps for people who are history freaks, most Americans know virtually nothing about the history of the world before 1776. And most American children go to school and they begin to learn history from 1776 because what happened before was BC. I've been speaking in churches now for 20 years and in synagogues, and the message is a message of 1,400 years of warfare between Islam and basically everybody else. One of the most prophetic verses in the whole Bible is actually in Genesis 16, verse 11, in which Hagar, the handmaiden of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, bears Abraham's first child, and his name is Ishmael. And even before Ishmael, who is the father of Islam, the father of the Islamic people, even though nobody asked for Ishmael's permission, Islam came into the picture 2,200 years after the life and death of Ishmael. But the Muslims believe in the God of Ishmael, not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as do the Christians and the Jews. And this verse, one of the most tragic verses, one of the most prophetic verses in the whole Bible, Genesis 16, verse 11 says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto Hagar and said to her, you're going to have a son. His name is going to be Ishmael, because God heard your cries." Ishmael means God heard. "And this son, Ishmael, will be a wild ass, a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against all his brethren's hands, and all his brethren's hands will be against his hand, and he will dwell in the face of his brethren." Now, in American slang, when somebody says, "Hey man, you're in my face," that means war. And this is precisely what we see in Genesis 16, verse 11, that Ishmael would live in the face of his brethren. And at the end of chapter 25 of Genesis, "And Ishmael died in the face of his brethren." And as Jesus said, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." And Islam is the religion of the sword. And Ishmael is the patriarch of that religion, just as Muhammad is the prophet of that religion. This is an ideology that threatens Jews, Christians. I believe it is the Armageddon. And we see this system coming home to haunt the world. And if Americans, and if people from all over the world, and if Israelis and Jews don't understand the Bible prophecies of Genesis 16, verse 11, and then later in the Bible, other prophecies that point to a master race, a master enemy race that is coming against everything that Jews and Christians believe in. And we see this, I believe, in the rise, the third and final rise of the Turkish Empire. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Middle East. I want to go back to the Arab invasions, and then I want to talk about the rise of the Turks. You have to remember that the Turks were nomadic peoples that came from, basically from Mongolia, the area just to the west of Mongolia, from what is known today as the Stans, like I said before, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. These Turks, over a period of hundreds of years, encroached upon the area known as Anatolia. And Anatolia, which most people know today as modern Turkey, most people do not remember that the Byzantine Empire ruled that land for 1,000 years. We shouldn't forget that Rome collapsed around the year 453 at the hands of the Goths and the Visigoths and the Huns. And basically, the greatness of Rome was transferred to what it was known as the Eastern Roman Empire. And it was about 1,000 years later, in 1453, 1,000 years later, that we see the Turks defeating the Byzantines. The Byzantine Empire lasted for 1,000 years. The Greek Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Empire, lasted for 1,000 years. And today, you cannot almost find any Christians in Turkey. The Turks have ethnically cleansed the land of its Christians. There are 20,000 Jews left in Turkey. I don't know how long this program or when this program will be shown, but in January and early February, there were a number of very important international conferences. For example, there was a conference in Munich, Germany, in which the president of Israel, Shimon Peres, participated, and Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey. And for those people who do not know the relationship between the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, and the modern country known as Turkey, Israel has had very, very good, very, very correct relations with the Turkish people, the Turkish government, the Turkish military. Israel has been having exports of defense articles, of weapons to the Turkish military, Turkey, of course, being a part of NATO, over $1 billion a year of sales to the Turks. Israeli tourism to Turkey was in the hundreds of thousands. And something has been happening. Something has been changing, and it's not a good change. And Tayyip Erdogan spoke 17 minutes at this conference in Munich, and President Shimon Peres then spoke 32 minutes, 15 minutes more. And Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, said, I want 15 minutes to reply to Shimon Peres. And the MC said, you know, you spoke your time. Everybody speaks his time. There's no question here of replying to what this leader or that leader says. And Erdogan began to get very infuriated and very angry. And he said that as a result of Israel's 3-week military operation in Gaza in January of 2009, that Israel was a war crimes country. For those who don't remember, about 400 terrorists, Hamas terrorists, were killed, pinpoint. But of course, there was some collateral damage and a few hundred civilians died also. Don't forget also that the Hamas was using women and children as human shields. And so many times there is no choice in war, and there is collateral damage. And so, of course, Israel, because a few hundred terrorists were killed and a few hundred civilians were killed, there were those people who said that Israel was a war crimes country. Now, Shimon Peres did not answer Tayyip Erdogan, but I would answer Tayyip Erdogan. And in addition to the 8 principles of the Bible Bloc Party, the Judeo-Christian Western Civilization Party that I'm working to form in Israel, I think it is fair to add a 9th principle, and that is the Turks are guilty of genocide. The Turks are a war crimes country. The Turks killed 1.5 million Armenians in 1914, 1915. It is a matter of record that Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany, said, because the Turks killed 1.5 million Armenian Christians, and nobody said a thing about it, we Nazis will be able to kill 6 million Jews. That's what Hitler said. It is not a secret that the Turks committed genocide against Christians, and they killed 1.5 million Armenians, 1/3 of the Armenians living on the face of the earth, exactly like the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, which killed 1/3 of the Jewish people living on the face of the earth. And the Turks, unlike the Germans, the Turks refused to own up. They refused to take responsibility, and they refused to recognize the sin of genocide. There's also another aspect of the war crimes of Turkey, and that is the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds, the killing of the Kurds, and the refusal to give 20 million Kurdish people a state of their own. The whole world pounces on Israel to create a Palestinian state, 4 million Palestinians, when the fact is that Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, is 70% Palestinian. So the Palestinians already have a state. Gaza, which is now totally Judenfrei, meaning there are no Jews in Gaza. The Jews pulled out of Gaza. They have a second Palestinian state in Gaza, ruled by the Hamas. What they want now is another Palestinian state ruled by Abu Mazen of the PLO, the Fatah, in the West Bank. And of course, there are those people who say that the Arab-Israeli villages should form a Palestinian state. So you're going to have 4 Palestinian states for 4 million people, when the Kurds are 20 million people and they don't even have one state. And they're being ethnically cleansed. And if you are a Kurd in Turkey and you speak Kurdish, you will be put in jail. So you tell me Turkey is not a war crime state. And so I want to go back to the history. When you hear the name Istanbul, Istanbul used to be Constantinople. Constantinople was the second Rome, after the Rome which is in Italy. And yet, after hundreds of years, the Turkish invading tribes coming in from Western Asia came in and conquered Anatolia, decimated the Byzantines. By the way, we don't know our history. In 1923, the Turks expelled every last Greek, almost every last Greek, out of Anatolia. Of course, there was a population transfer, and Turks from Greece were sent back to Turkey. But the point I'm saying is that today you look at Turkey as an Islamic country where there are no Christians, there are virtually no Jews, and yet the Eastern Roman Empire, early Christianity, Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, was what is today Islamic Turkey. And the Turks, the Muslims, made sure to it that today, in the year 2009, there are almost no more Christians in Turkey. Very few Christians. Very few Jews. And by the way, when Tayyip Erdogan returned to Turkey after he walked out of this conference with Shimon Peres, he was received with a hero's welcome in Turkey. And there were store signs being put up on the storefront windows. Armenians and Jews, not allowed. Dogs, yes, allowed. This was in the stores in Turkey. There are very worrisome signs that the time of the Jews in Turkey is ending, and the Jews will have to flee from Turkey. God is shutting down all of the Jewish diasporas in the Islamic countries. You have only Iran, Turkey, and Morocco. Those are the last 3 Jewish diasporas in the Islamic world. And Turkey, I believe, will not last very long. So let's do a little more history. You had, of course, the Arab invasions. Muhammad started his Islamic wars. 711, the Arabs conquered Spain, Portugal, and France after they conquered North Africa and the Middle East, Arabia, massacring Jews and Christians who did not convert to Islam. Some, of course, were allowed to survive temporarily as dhimmis, or subjugated people, second-class citizens. As I said before, as we look into the time of the Crusades, we see the beginnings of the rise of first the Seljuk Turks, later the Ottoman Turks, and like I said before, wave after wave of tribesmen, Turkic tribesmen came in from the steppes, and the Mongols came in. And at a certain stage, the Mongols and the Turks converted to Islam. So we're talking about the 13th century, 14th century. But by 1453, there was a new power on the scene, and it was Islamic Ottoman Turkey. And I'm going to say something which I don't think really anyone has ever said before, Jew or Christian, and that is that Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain in 1492 did something which today, to this day, many Jewish people see this as a form of Holocaust. And for the Jewish people, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 was a Holocaust. Unfortunately, the Jews were aligned with the Muslims in Spain in 1492, and the Muslims losing to the Christian side were expelled, and if the Jews were allied with the losing side, the Jews were expelled also as allies of the Muslims. Because at that time in history, it is true that the Muslim rulers in Morocco and Turkey, which, by the way, was one country at the time, were better to the Jews than the Catholics were in Spain. Spain had 3 Islamic invasions and almost the 4th. The first invasion in 711 was the Arab invasion. Then you had 2 Moroccan invasions, the Almoravides and the Almohadin, who came in the 11th and 12th centuries. In 1492, if you know your history and you know your geography, which most Americans don't, and by the way, most Jews and Israelis don't either, Turkey was now under the suzerainty, the rule. Morocco was under the rule of Turkey. In other words, the Turkish fleet was just off the coast of Spain in 1492. The reason Ferdinand and Isabella had to expel the last Moorish king, Boabdil, from Granada was to ensure that there was no back door open in Spain to allow a 4th Islamic invasion, this time led by the Turks. The Turks were about to invade Spain in 1492. You know, as an American-born student, and I think everyone who's watching this show in the United States knows, that in 1588 there was this tremendous battle of the Spanish Armada. In 1588, the Catholic Spanish fleet was defeated in a massive sea battle with the British, by the way, and the Dutch navies, and the Protestant navies against the Catholic navies. And they wiped out the Spanish fleet. That was in 1588. Every American knows that. But 17 years before, there was another sea battle that no Americans know about. 1571, you had the Battle of Lepanto. Very few Americans ever heard of the name Lepanto. And Lepanto, the reason you didn't hear about it was because Lepanto was a victory of the Catholics over the Turks. The Spanish fleet wiped out the Turkish fleet at Lepanto in the Mediterranean. This was the beginning of the end of the fall of the beginning of the end of Turkey, of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. Because as in the 20th century and 21st century, whoever controls the skies controls the world. In those days, whoever controlled the seas controlled the world. And until 1571, it was the Turks that controlled the Mediterranean. And to break the back of the Turkish control of the Mediterranean, the Spanish fleet, the Catholic Spanish fleet, had to go into battle and defeat the Turkish navy. But of course, Americans don't know that because the American educational system doesn't want to give the Catholics any credit for anything. So, of course, 1588, everybody knows that because the British defeated the Spanish. Well, that's okay. But people should know about the Battle of Lepanto. The Turks were at the gates of Vienna for 200 years. Most people know very little about Serbia or about the Battle of Kosovo Field. In 1389, the Turks defeated the Christians, the Serbs. The Turks went on to conquer Albania, what is today Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, parts of the Ukraine. So, whereas the Arabs invaded Europe from the west, the Turks invaded Europe from the east. You know, I have to tell you a very personal experience. Last April 2008, I was invited for the first time in my life to speak in Austria and also in Poland. And I've been many times in Switzerland, and this is a very unusual trip because I flew El Al from Israel to Switzerland, and I spoke to a Christian group in Basel. The next day, my Swiss host drove me to Bad Ischl in Austria, which is a 5-hour drive in their RV. So I preached in a Baptist church in Bad Ischl in Switzerland, in Austria. The next morning, my Austrian host drove me to Vienna, and from there I took a Polish train called the Sobieski train from Vienna to Warsaw. Who was Sobieski? Sobieski was the king of Poland, and in 1683 he came down from Poland with his Polish army and defeated the Turks at the Battle of Vienna. 1683 was the beginning of the end of the Turkish siege of Vienna and Austria. Soon afterwards, the Hungarians, after 150 years of Islamic occupation, the Hungarians were freed. And then the Romanians fought and were freed. And This was a process of hundreds of years of wars and battles and persecutions of the Turks against the Christians. 1912, there was the Third War of the Balkans. 1902, 1903, 1912 were the battles of the Balkans, in which the final borders of Europe were drawn. In other words, the Turks were pushed back in 1902, 1903, 1912 to what are the borders today. In other words, Turkey in Anatolia with a little bit of Turkey across the Dardanelles in what is today the Balkans or Europe. Americans, Jews and Christians, most Europeans, very, very few people know that the wars with Turkey ended less than a century ago. World War I, of course, the Turks were allied with the Germans. But Turkey basically was pushed out of Europe only 100 years ago, and this was after almost a millennia of control in Eastern Europe. I have to tell you a little story. I have spoken in Greece. I was in Athens. I spoke to a group of Christians in Athens. And my Christian friends in Greece told me something very interesting. They said that in 1923, during the great Greco-Turkish War, in which Ataturk basically defeated Venizelos, the population of Greece was 10 million Christians. The population of Islamic Turkey was 10 million. It was 10 million versus 10 million. Today, in the 21st century, the population of Greece is 10 million Christians, just as it was 100 years ago, but the Turks are 70 million. In other words, the Turkish population grew 7 times, whereas the Greek population remained the same. Of course, we have to take into consideration that the Greeks have a tremendous diaspora, much as the Jews have a tremendous diaspora. But today, Turkey outnumbers the Greeks in Greece 7-1. I have Greek friends in Cyprus. In 1974, the Turks came to, quote unquote, the defense of their fellow Turks and occupied 40% of Cyprus. My Christian friends in Cyprus say to me they have no doubt that when the Turks are ready, the Turks will take the remainder of the island. Turkey has its eyes set on Cyprus. Turkey has its eyes set on eastern Greece, because you have in eastern Greece today 100,000 Turkic Muslims living in eastern Greece still. Something that many people don't understand in American politics is that Bill Clinton supported the wrong side in the Balkan Wars. With the breakup of the former Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, Bill Clinton supported the Muslims in Bosnia at the expense of the Serbs, the Christians. By the way, the Serbs were the allies of the Jews and the Christians in World War I and World War II. Then the Clinton administration supported the Muslims in Kosovo, the Albanian Muslims, who basically invaded over centuries Serb land. And so today, thanks to Bill Clinton, there is not one Islamic republic in Europe, but 3. Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo. The 4th Islamic republic will be Macedonia. Macedonia today is 40% Muslim, and the Christians already see the writing on the wall that the United States policy is always to support the Muslims, because the Muslims have the oil, the Muslims have the petrodollars, the Muslims have the numbers. It's like Israel. The Christians, the Serbs, the Macedonians, the Israelis are to be sacrificed because they don't have the oil, they don't have the petrodollars, and they don't have the money. Now, Turkey used to reach the Adriatic coast, just across from Italy. Don't forget that Albania was part of Turkey. Bosnia, Kosovo were part of Turkey. Macedonia was part of Turkey. Greece was part of Turkey. The Turks dream to return to their conquest. When you look at the maps in Turkey, in the schools, the land bridge between Istanbul and Italy is there, the Turkish land bridge. Don't forget, Morocco, Algeria, The whole North African coast was once part of Turkey. Turkey was an empire that went from the Atlantic all the way to China. If we look to the east, let's look at China, for example. Most people don't understand that there is a territorial mass of 1/6 of the Chinese People's Republic, known as Xinjiang province, Xinjiang in Chinese. Xinjiang is a desert area, by the way, full of oil, and the majority of the population there is Turkic. There is a group there called the Uyghurs, and they're Turkic Muslims. Their capital is Urumqi. These are names most Americans have never heard of. And the Islamic world today is supporting an irredentist rebellion by these Turkic Muslims in China to break away from China and form a new country called East Turkestan. So not only do you have the 6 republics that broke away from Russia, the Islamic plan is to have a 7th Turkic republic to break away from China. By the way, for those who are following President Obama's promise to shut down Gitmo at Guantanamo, there are, I believe, 7 Chinese Muslims that cannot be returned to China because they will be killed by the Chinese or tortured and killed by the Chinese if they are returned to China. So there are people in the ACLU who are saying that these Chinese Islamic terrorists must be given asylum in the U.S. So you have, and it's something I've been sharing in a long time, you know, the Muslims are fighting the Chinese, the Buddhists. The Muslims are fighting the Hindus, the Indians. The Muslims are fighting the Jews and the Israelis. The Muslims are fighting the Christians and the Americans. And as I said many times before, the Muslims are fighting each other, which is, of course, the fulfillment of Genesis 16, verse 11, of Ishmael being a wild donkey, his hand against all his brothers and all his brothers' hands against him. Now, let's look for a moment at modern Turkey. At the turn of the century, there arose a general, Mustafa Kemal, who became known as Ataturk. Ataturk in Turkish means the father of the Turks. And he was a modern, forward-looking Turkish Muslim who did not believe in Islam. And if you remember, basically at around the same time, you had these socialist and communist ideologies that were basically negating all religions. And Ataturk was saying that Islam was the bane of Turkey, that Islam was the main obstacle for Turkey to become modernized. And Ataturk canceled the Arabic alphabet, and because Turkish actually is a Indo-European language, and he decided to switch over to the Latin letters, Latin alphabet. Ataturk shut down the mosques. Ataturk forced Turkey into the 20th century. And until the most recent years, Turkey was considered a secular Islamic country. In other words, people were Muslim by faith, but women could go without headscarves, women could go to universities, women were not bundled up and hidden like they are in the fanatic Islamic countries. But that's all changing. Now, why is it changing? What is the process we see happening in Turkey in which Turkey is changing? If you know the history of Soviet Russia, at the turn of the century, you had massive investments from the West in Tsarist Russia. And serfs, who were modern-day slave peasants, fled from their villages in the interior of Russia, and they came to St. Petersburg and to Moscow looking for jobs. And there were jobs, but there were not enough jobs. And so there were a lot of unemployed, starving Russian peasants in the big cities. And the Communist Party, one of the reasons the Communist Party succeeded is they said, we're going to give the people land and bread and peace. And the communists came to power because basically the communists knew how to feed the poor people. Today in Turkey, we see a very parallel situation. We see peasants coming from all over the Turkish countryside into Istanbul, into Ankara, into the main industrial centers looking for jobs, because no matter how poorly they're paid, it is better than in the villages from which they came. And what happens is there's tremendous unemployment in Turkey, over 20%. So how are these people fed? The Islamic charities feed the people. Now, when you're starving and you're fed by an Islamic charity, you're going to go to the mosque to be fed, and you're going to become an Islamist. Turkey, over the last 10, 15 years, has been going increasingly in the direction of fanatic Islam, all because the Saudis have been providing money, very much like they have been providing money to the Hamas in Gaza, which has done exactly the same thing, and the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, which has done exactly the same thing, which is to feed the destitute and the poor and give them medical services. In return, these people owe their allegiance to the fanatic Islamist parties. A few months ago, there was the report of a coup threat in Turkey against the Islamic regime, which has been in power for over 10 years. All of these generals who are patriots, who are patriotic Turkish modern Western people, and they understand the threat to modern-day Turkey from the fanatic Islamic parties, all these people were thrown in jail. Today, the Turkish military, which was always the defender of democracy and modern-day Turkey, have been shunted aside by the fanatic Islamic party. And again, all of this funded by the Saudis. Turkey today is undergoing an Islamic religious revival. Again, Christians are gone, Jews are gone. The Kurds, who have a slightly different language, are suppressed. Turkey is developing into a fanatic, religious, nationalist country that it was not for the last century. If you go into the Turkish schools today, you do not see the map of Anatolia. You see the whole Central Asia and all the 6 republics that broke away from Russia, and the East Turkestan, the western part of China, are all part of Turkey today. Those countries are all painted red with the moon crescent and star of Turkey. I want to go back for a second to Poland. And I have to tell you something. I have a very interesting life. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Protestant. I'm not a Messianic. I'm not a Christian. I am a Jew of the Jews. And yet, in America, I speak primarily in Protestant churches. And now in Poland, which is a very conservative Catholic country, the doors are opening for me, of course, in Protestant churches and also in Catholic churches and in Catholic radio. I did a radio show. I took the Sobieski train to Warsaw. My Polish host there took me to a little Catholic radio station in Warsaw. And they were flabbergasted. How can a Jew say the things that he's saying, which is so supportive of the Christian agenda in Poland? And there's a big radio station, the biggest Catholic radio station in Poland, called Radio Maria. And Radio Maria is constantly bashed in the Israeli press as an anti-Semitic Catholic radio station. But Radio Maria heard me. They said, we got to have this Avi Lipkin and an all-night show, because my message is the message of Christian revival. In the case of Poland, the Christians are mostly Catholics. Now, why is it so important to work for a revival in Poland? And I'll give you the reason. Poland is a very conservative country. Western Europe is primarily post-Christian. Western Europe today, the churches are shutting down. Western Europe today, the mosques are buying out the churches. Islam is growing in Western Europe, and the Muslims today reach 20 and 30%. In Austria, they're 30%. In Switzerland, they're 20%. In France, they're almost 20%. The West European countries are now so afraid to touch Islam for fear of an intifada or a major breakout of hostilities, civil war in the Western European countries. We do not yet see a very big Islamic population in Poland. By the way, the Greek church in Athens does not allow for the mosques to be built. By the way, I'm going to Switzerland, God willing, in June to help the Swiss people to prevent a referendum which will allow the Muslims to build minarets. Because once they have minarets, they're going to be yelling out Allahu Akbar 5 times a day. And of course, the first time is at 4:30 in the morning, and wake up all the Christians from their sleep when they're yelling out Allahu Akbar in Switzerland. And I and my wife, God willing, will speak in 12 cities in Switzerland. So the doors are opening up for me and my message and our message and God's message big time in Europe. But getting back to the Catholic Church. Europe, since it is post-Christian, supports homosexuality, supports abortion. These are, putting aside the morality and God's commandments for a moment, they are depopulating systems. Even Italy, a Catholic country where it was always known as a baby boomer country. Today, Italy has a negative growth rate. Now, if you want to have a welfare state and you have a negative growth rate, you must import new blood, young people, to work in order to build the infrastructure, support the infrastructure, and most important of all, to pay the taxes to maintain that welfare state. And so there are many European countries that look very favorably upon integrating Turkey into the European Union. Because if Turkey is integrated into the European Union, there will be an unlimited flow of laborers and young workers into Europe. The problem here is the following. Let's do numbers. Europe today is approximately 300 million Christians. They have 40 million Muslims, which is not a problem. If Turkey joins the European Union, it will no longer be 40 million Muslims. It'll be 40 million Muslims. It will be 70 million Turks from Anatolia, which brings the total to 110 million Muslims out of 300 million, in addition to 300 million Christians. But since the Turkish government is ready to give passports, Turkish passports, to the 200 million Turkic Muslims from the former Soviet republics, what we're talking about now is 40 million Muslims in Europe. We're talking about 70 million Anatolia Turks and 200 million former Soviet Turks. So we're talking about the moment Turkey joins the European Union, there will be 310 million Muslims and 300 million Christians. What does it mean? The entry of Turkey into the European Union means an automatic Islamic majority in Europe, which is basically another step in the direction of the destruction of Christian Europe and another step in the direction of the destruction of Israel. So why does the Catholic Church want me? Because I'm coming and saying things that no Christian can say, which is basically Turkey must not be allowed to join the European Union because that'll be the end of Christendom in the European Union. So you have the first Islamic invasion of Europe in 711. Then you have the defeat of Constantinople in 1453 and the Islamic Turkish invasions of Europe. And now we see the third and final rise of Islam in Europe through the Turks. And like I said before, the Turks are Sunnis. The Turks are aligned with the Hamas. The Turks are aligned with Saudi Arabia. If Egypt falls to the Muslim Brotherhood 2 years from now in the next elections, the peace agreement with Israel will be terminated by the Egyptians. Israel will face another war with this new Muslim Brotherhood leadership in Egypt. Israel, if it hands over the Golan to the Shiite leadership of Syria, tomorrow will wake up in the morning with a Muslim Brotherhood leadership, Sunnis, not Shiites, in Damascus. And so we see dominoes falling in the direction of the Sunni Islam, with Turkey being the greatest leader of all of these Islamic countries. Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, the Palestinian areas, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and of course the 6 republics that broke away from the Soviet Union. So we're talking basically about 1 billion Muslims coming together in a great Islamic revival, which I call the Armageddon. This is the battle that we see coming against the Christians of Europe and the Jews of Israel and the Christians of America. I hope I don't offend any Jews who may be watching this program, but like I said in other programs, I'm a Jew who loves to read different books. I love to read the New Testament. I love to read the Quran, the Hadith. I love to see what other religions say, other ideologies say. I want to understand who my ally is, and my ally is the Christian. I want to know who my enemy is, and my enemy is the Muslim. By the way, Jesus teaches to love the enemy, and I love the enemy. My motto to the Christian world is, bring them to the Lord, or they'll bring you to the sword. Because the God of the Jews and the Christians is God, the Lord, a God who hates the sword. But the God of Islam is the sword. And they call their religion Deen as-Sayf, religion of the sword. And in the end times, there will be a final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And in my opinion, the forces that are the forces that believe in the sword, they are the evil forces. They will destroy the Jews on Saturday, Christians on Sunday, Hindus, Buddhists, and blacks any other time. And then, like I said before also, the Sunnis kill the Sunnis, the Shiites kill the Shiites, and the Sunnis and the Shiites kill each other. Now, as a person who does read the New Testament, and I know that a lot of Christians are very, very interested in end-time prophecies. And there are very, very great people like Tim LaHaye, Van Impe, a very good friend of mine, and others, who have different approaches, of course, to end-time prophecy and who's the Armageddon. And I would say I identify most of all, if I'm going to quote any Christian prophecy student or anyone who goes into the eschatology, I would say Walid Shoaibat is a very, very dear friend, very dear brother I love very much. And actually, it was he who said to me that when you talk about the, I think it's the Armageddon War, he's talking about Libya, which is Sunni, Iran, which may be Sunni at that time, and Kush. Now, Kush is mistranslated in English to be Ethiopia, but it's not Ethiopia, it's Sudan, which is Sunni. And Walid Shoaibat himself said something which I concur with completely, and that is that if you're reading the book of Revelation, that's a book that refers specifically to the Islamic countries. It doesn't refer to Christian countries, or it refers to the big threat that is very, very clear to anyone who sees the developments that's happening in the Middle East today. In Revelation, and again, you'll forgive a Jew from quoting Revelation, but in Revelation 12, there is a story. This is one of the first New Testament teachings I ever learned in my life. This was in November of 1990. I was visiting in a church, Trinity Church in Beaumont, Texas, and Pastor Howard Cameron got up and he started preaching Revelation 12. And he said that there was this dragon, and by the way, it's interesting. There is this woman bearing a child. So, of course, you can say that that's Mary, and the child that she's bearing is Jesus. And underneath the feet of the woman in the netherworld is a dragon, a beast, a serpent. And together with the dragon is a moon crescent. The moon crescent is the symbol of Islam, speaking about prophecy. And this dragon is interested in devouring the mother bearing the child. And we're talking, of course, about a metaphor. There is a battle in the heavenlies between the good angels and the bad angels. And to make a long story short, the mother and child escape. Now, it says there also, the dragon was wroth, the dragon was angry, because the dragon knew its time was short. And I don't claim any of the credit. I learned this from a Christian pastor, but he said the time is short means that the oil is going to run out one day. What gives the dragon its power, what gives the dragon its strength is the oil petrodollars, and of course the numerous population that these people have. And again, the mother and child could be literally Mary and Jesus, but the metaphor is the Jewish nation is the mother, and the Christian nation born out of the Jewish mother is the child. And Pastor Cameron said something very interesting. He said that who killed the Jews and the Christians during the time of the Romans? The Romans were killing Jews and Christians, throwing them, the book of Revelation was written on the island of Patmos by John around the year 70 AD. And that was a time in which Jews and early Christian believers, who were Jews, by the way, until 325, the Council of Nicaea, Christians were Jews, And they were being thrown to the gladiators. They were being thrown to the lions. And so whoever kills the Jew is going to kill the Christian. Whoever kills the Christian is going to kill the Jew. So 2,000 years ago, it was the Romans. In the last century, we saw the Nazis killing Jews and killing Christians. We saw the communists killing Jews and killing Christians. And today, it is Islam that is killing Jews and killing Christians. Whoever kills the Jew is going to kill the Christian. Whoever kills the Christian is going to kill the Jew. And this was the teaching of Revelation 12. Revelation 17, we see some other interesting things. We see a harlot riding the dragon. Now, in my opinion, I say the harlot is the banking corporation system, the oil companies. A harlot is a man, woman, or system paid for services rendered. And Islam has the oil, Islam has the money, Islam is growing in strength. And unfortunately, in Western Europe, for example, and in certain parts of the West, we see leaderships totally succumbing and surrendering to Islam because of bribery, because of oil, because of money, because of numbers. And in the case of Poland, Poland is the last Christian country in Europe that is ready to stop Islam at any cost. And it says that we will witness the beheadings. This is Revelation 17. We will witness the beheadings of the saints and the followers of Jesus Christ. There are two groups there, and Pastor Howard Cameron explained this. He said the saints are the Jewish prophets. The followers of Jesus Christ are the apostles and the disciples. Again, whoever kills the Jew kills the Christian. I do believe we are not looking at something that will happen in another year or two. It could be 5, 10, 15 years from now. But in my opinion, we see such a strong resurgence of fundamentalist Sunni Islam because of the petrodollars, because of the numbers that these people have. And the only thing that can stop it is not the Jews. The only thing that can stop it is a Christian revival. The Christians in America, the Christians in Canada, the Christians in Latin America, the Christians in Europe must wake up. And again, I'm a Jew from Israel. I am not a Christian. And I have an ulterior motive for everything I say, and that is for Israel to survive, the Christians must have a Christian revival. And in the end, if it is so that Christians will not have a revival, there will be a remnant of Christians, there will be a remnant of Jews. And as I said in my previous program, a lot of these Jews and Christians will end up in Jerusalem, will end up in the final days of judgment. And the Messiah will come to Jerusalem for the Jews and the Christians. And in the end, we all know who's in control, and that's God. But we will all be judged, we will all come before the throne, and God will ask each and every one of us, what did we do for him in his name? What could we have done? What did we not do? What could we have done and we didn't do? And as most Christians know, there is a saying, there is a teaching in the New Testament, faith without works is dead. And so I plead with Christians to have a revival. If the Christians have a revival, Israel will have a survival. And since the Christians are part of Israel, it's the Christian survival as well. And may God bless America and Israel and Europe, and may God bless all of humanity with the defeat of Satan and sending Satan to the pits of hell for 1,000 years. Thank you.